Hi, my name is Chris Melnick, and today I'm going to talk about wells and septic systems. Wells and septic systems are very common in Nova Scotia. Basically, any home outside of the city and the main towns have them. If you're interested in waterfront properties, the vast majority of them will be on well and septic systems. In short, a well and septic system introduces more risk, potential complications, and precautions that must be made. That being said, as long as you understand how to live with these systems, your experience with them can be fairly trouble-free. First, we'll talk about wells. There are two types of wells, dug wells and drilled wells. For the most part, drilled wells are the preferred well. There are reasons why you may need to have a dug well though, but to understand this, we'll first need to talk about the soil and earth conditions here in Nova Scotia. In the earth itself, you have bedrock. This can be granite, sandstone, or limestone, among other types of rock. Sometimes the bedrock will just be beneath the surface, or sometimes it'll be 30 feet down, under what's known as glacial till. This is made up of clay, silt, sand, and rock. In the glacial till, you can have overburden aquifers, which is groundwater found in the saturated glacial till. The uppermost boundary of this is known as the water table. The water is often found about 15 feet down in Nova Scotia. A dug well extracts its water from this source. Because of this, a dug well is on average 20 feet deep, but can be 30 feet deep. This level of water can increase or decrease depending on the season. The till conditions can also be more or less permeable, meaning that water can move very slowly to refill the well. Because of these factors, dug wells are made 3 feet wide, so they themselves can effectively act partially as a storage tank. Each foot of a dug well can theoretically hold about 200 liters of water. Sometimes in very dry conditions, a dug well can go dry, and people pay water trucks to pump water into their dug well, so they can still use water. I've heard of cases where a couple needed a water truck to refill their well every week or so for 6 weeks, at a cost of a couple $100 each time. But this all depends on the soil conditions. If the groundwater is very permeable, the water will fairly quickly leach back into the ground. So the process isn't very efficient, but it can get people by in a pinch. Also, occasionally they'll be pressurized underground water sources. It seems strange that the water table isn't perfectly flat here, like water in a lake or bucket, but you have to remember that groundwater has to come from somewhere, like rain seeping into the ground or laterally from a different source, so it's flowing from higher ground to lower ground. The soil itself effectively slows down that movement, like a waterfall in slow motion. If a large amount of water needs to transition from higher ground to much lower ground and is confined from moving sideways because of an impermeable layer like clay, the water can't pass through it, and the water is forced down and put under pressure. Tapping into this pressure is known as Artesian wells. It's pretty interesting. Now back to normal dug wells. Because the amount of water can vary greatly depending on soil conditions and time of year, well inspectors do not like performing flow tests, recovery tests, or claiming a dug well is good or not, because it can change in a few months and then you'd be very angry at them. If you're interested in a home with a dug well, you have to heavily rely on what the seller's experience was with that water source. A statement about the well is often found in the property disclosure statement. Also, be aware that construction projects and neighboring properties can affect your water. I've heard of that situation a number of times. To fix this, they either dig deeper in a new location or drill a well. A dug well is usually dug with excavators and backhoes. Now we'll talk about drilled wells. Drilled wells go into the bedrock and extract water from bedrock aquifers. Bedrock aquifers are fractures or cracks that store water. Because of this, a drilled well must be deeper, and since it's into rock, they can't use excavators and backhoes but drill, hence the term drilled well. These wells are usually 6 inches wide and can be up to 400 feet deep, but usually about 100 to 200 feet deep. Because it's much deeper, this water is generally more reliable and doesn't have the same issue with seasons that a dug well can have. Since a drilled well seems like the clear winner, you may be wondering why anyone would put a dug well in. Well, there are really only a few explanations. First, The well could be old, before drilled wells were common. If there were no issues with the dug well, there would be no reason to drill a new one. The second reason is cost. Dug wells are generally substantially cheaper. If the area is known to have decently producing dug wells, making another one at a much lower cost than a drilled well could make sense. The third reason is just feasibility. Sometimes with oceanfront properties, the water you're extracting from the bedrock aquifers is salt water because it's too close to the ocean. If the soil conditions allow, a dug well could be the only option. In some oceanfront areas where there's no glacial till, neither a dug well or drilled well can be constructed. In these cases, a cistern is used. A cistern is a big holding tank that can be refilled by a water truck periodically. It can also be filled with collected rainwater. This is really only a last resort. Occasionally, you'll see cisterns in addition to wells if the well does not produce a high enough or reliable enough water flow. With wells, you'll have a pump either inside the well or inside the house and a pressure tank. This pressure tank acts like a mini pressurized water storage tank so that the well pump doesn't have to turn on and off every single time you briefly run the faucet. Think of it like a mini water tower. This reduces the amount of wear on the pump. When you're on a well or cistern, you'll usually have a water treatment system. This is because depending on where you are, the well may have bacteria or levels of minerals that are deemed too high for consumption, like arsenic or lead. But for nearly every water issue, there is a treatment option to fix it. These levels can change over time though. When buying a home on a well, this is why a water test is very recommended. Just because it was okay 15 years ago does not mean it still is. Here are some other things to remember about wells. Number one, the well pump is electric, which means that if you lose power, you also lose water. Having a generator is a very good idea for this reason. Number two, it's not advisable to use a long sprinkler with a dug well. In the summer, groundwater levels are low anyways, so you may use up all the water in the well storage and need to wait until it recovers. It's also not advisable to let wells run dry if you can avoid it. Running the pump with no water can damage it. Number three, even a drilled well can go dry if you're using too much water, like to fill a swimming pool. When you heavily use a well, you can draw down the water table in that immediate area. This creates a cone of depression. If you plan to do something like this, you should pace yourself. Now I'll talk about septic systems. Septic systems in principle are fairly straightforward. Waste from a home goes into a tank. In the tank, the solids sink to the bottom and the liquids go out a pipe into a network of perforated pipes, sometimes called fingers, that leach the liquids into the ground. This is called the field. This field can be a grid or just a line. This works just with gravity as everything flows downhill. Sometimes this conventional design cannot be built because of the soil conditions, the slope of the lot, or how close it is to a body of water. In this case, other designs can be built. One more common design involves having the field higher than the tank. In this instance, a pump station is used where the liquids need to be pumped up to the field. Since this involves electricity, you also need power for this to operate. When you buy a home with a septic system, you should have it inspected. This involves taking a look in the tank and in the field. When looking in the tank, they make sure that the liquid level is just below the exit pipe. If it's lower, the only explanation is that it was recently pumped, or there's a leak in the tank and it needs to be replaced. They then put a camera in the pipes in the field to make sure that the pipes are not crushed or have any blockages. They'll also run water through the system to ensure that it's able to drain out into the field. Occasionally over time, the soil conditions can change, and the field needs to be dug up, have new material brought in, and have a new field installed. This can happen as early as 20 years, but usually lasts much longer. Here's some things to remember when you have a septic system. Number one, since the liquids from the system are leached into the earth, you should avoid the excessive use of harsh cleaners or bleach. Number two, avoid putting anything down the drains that could cause a blockage, like coffee grounds, paper towel, or grease. Number three, don't park or drive on top of the septic field or tank. Number four, don't grow bushes or trees over top of the field. The roots can eventually cause blockages in the pipes. Number 5, septic tanks typically need to be pumped every 2 to 5 years. This depends on how much the system is used relative to the usage it was designed for. Finally, number 6, if your septic system has a pump station, you need power for it to operate. So again, a generator's a good idea. In conclusion, you need to take certain precautions when you're on a well and septic system, but a proven dug well, drilled well, or newer septic system can be fairly trouble-free if you do take these precautions. On municipal water and sewer, a family of 4 could expect to spend over $100 a month on those services, or over $1,200 a year. So buying a home on a well and septic could equate to a savings when the only predictable expense you would have is septic pumping at about $400 every 2 to 5 years. If the components or entire well or septic system are on their way out, it can be expensive though. Approximate cost for a new drilled well is about $15,000 and a septic system about $35,000. As always, I hope you've got some value out of this video. My contact information is in the description. Goodbye.